I want to let Megan Carter here introduce some of the technical housekeeping stuff, but I want to say thanks for coming to assessing the research data management landscape through practice and education. I'm Wade Bishop, and I always want to make sure to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services because IMLS funded the research we're going to talk about today, but more importantly, we want feedback from all of you in the ESIP community for what else our next steps might be.
All right, Wade, I will give my brief introduction. Welcome everyone. My name is Megan Carter. I'm ESIP's Community Director, and I'm here in a support role today, helping to host the Zoom session, but also planning to participate myself. Before we kick the session off, I wanted to give you a few reminders. I know we're all bordering on being Zoom experts at this point, but this session is being recorded. As you know already, we're using Zoom. There's a toolbar at the bottom of your screen, there should be anyways, where you can see a button for chat, a button for the participant windows. If you click those, they will open and you can see what's going on in both of those places. We ask that you please mute when you're not speaking. Cameras on, great for discussion when somebody's presenting, not really necessary. So feel free to turn them on in those cases. And if you don't want to turn your camera on, we're totally fine with that too. Please feel no pressure either way. You'll notice that we are having closed captioning today. If you have any questions about that or anything I've mentioned so far, feel free to direct message me in the chat. And finally, I just wanted to mention ESIP's community participation guidelines. These are similar to a code of conduct, and they outline expected behaviors and behaviors that will not be tolerated in our community, as well as what to do if you experience unacceptable behavior or witness unacceptable behavior. Please feel free to directly message me if anything happens during this call that you'd like to discuss. And I mean, you know, somebody you don't expect to be in the meeting. We are not expecting any of this. We are hoping for the best, planning for all possibilities. So thank you all for being here today, and pass it back to the organizers.
Thank you, Megan. Again, just to welcome everybody coming in right now. Thank you so much for attending. Without ESIP's membership, none of this material I'm about to share would exist, since most of the participants throughout the years of doing this have been from the ESIP community. So I'm just really grateful that we get to share what we found back with ESIP here at the summer meeting, as well as ask everybody to think through a few questions that we put in the chat as we go through. But let me give you an outline first. We have myself, Bradley Wade Bishop, Associate Professor here at the University of Tennessee. Hannah Collier and Ashley Rayheck are recent grads from the School of Information Sciences, and we'll be speaking about some of their practicum experiences and some of the research they did here at UT. Peter Organchiak is an assistant professor at the University of Denver's Library and Information Science Department, and Matthew Marinick. So some familiar names for sure, and we're just covering all kinds of different organizations because Matt and Peter both worked on our grant, the IMLS CALL program. CALL is an acronym for Collaborative Analysis Liaison Librarianship. The librarianship term obviously doesn't apply to many people in the ESIP community, but some of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that it takes to be that kind of information provider and assistant are actually pretty transferable regardless of the job title name. I'm going to review the CALL program itself in the greater detail, then turn it over to Ashley and Hannah to discuss some of their interview findings and practicum experience. Then I'm going to step back in and talk about survey validation, which was, you know, again, all the ESIP community. So thanks again for anybody who participated in that. And then we'll have most of the rest of the time facilitated some discussion from the educator perspective, with Peter being a professor, and employer perspective, with Matthew hiring several people out of different departments, different domains over time, and seeing what works best for them. Because I'm trying to really connect the dots between what we teach and have it be the most impactful that it possibly can be, also preparing students the best they can for that sort of first job, but also some reflection on all the things that we still might be missing. The CALL program was a 3-year project to expand the knowledge of science liaison librarianship. We had funding for 14 students. We're having a third cohort actually start this August. Excited, a very small cohort, but we had some leftover spaces. To inform the curriculum, we're conducting job analysis. That's something I'll cover in a little bit here, but it's basically the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required for you to do any job. But in this instance, we were looking at science liaison librarians, which happen to also be a very similar skill set to earth science data managers. And a few other things we had to do, but thank you so much, because this was one of our deliverables, is to disseminate study findings. There's a few papers out there already. There's a preprint available now of the work that Ashley, Hannah, and I did on some interviews, job analysis in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. A few years ago, this came out where I did work. Some of you may have remembered Durham. I was interviewing people. It was much easier to pop out to a interview room and do all that data collection there in person. Hard to imagine, but 5 years ago is when that happened. And then under review, we have a paper that's based on today's presentation. But the session prompts again were what would be the ideal curriculum to prepare you for your job. So obviously you experienced some kind of curriculum. A lot of thought went into what was in a lot of courses, a lot of programs for your educational journeys, but what would be ideal? Looking back, what would be better? What would be different? Maybe nothing. What knowledge, skills, and abilities do you expect from prospective employees, especially as people are hiring more and more and people from different backgrounds? What are you expecting? And then what are some things that you just need to learn on the job that don't fit neatly into any kind of classroom, online or otherwise? So just keep that in the back of your mind as we cover some of the stuff we've already found. First of all, for those of you not familiar with job analysis, it's just a research methodology where you're collecting data on what people do at work. Observable is an easy old one. It's an old film nowadays, but there was some job analysis in that particular movie, but original job analysis was really observing what people do. And the problem with intellectual work is it's hard to watch people sit and think and figure out, well, what is it they're actually doing? It's also kind of hard to describe because you might do a lot of things without ever thinking through all the stuff you had to know to be able to do it. But there is a whole field of study and many approaches to doing job analyses. One that I've used the most is called developing a curriculum. This approach is basically coming up with exactly the knowledge, skills, and abilities somebody needs to do, and then putting that into curriculum and making sure that people are learning those exact same things. There's a few assumptions that job incumbents know their job better than anyone else, better than their supervisor, better than the boss, better than the faculty. The people actually doing the work are who should explain what the job actually entails. And the best way, again, to the assumption is that if you have specific tasks, what it is that you're doing is not just, oh, this is what I sort of do. What your pitch would be at the coffee break at ESIP is different than saying like, well, actually I sit and I do this and X, Y, and Z, and that's what I'm doing week to week, month to month, and describing a job that way. It's a process that would start with interviews. So again, I've done this a couple times, interview job incumbents, sort of get an idea of what ESIP members, what earth science data managers are doing, what liaison librarianships people are doing, but then do a survey validation that would sort of take the findings from interviews and then have common responses that could be translated to something that's more generalizable. And I guess I'll turn over to Ashley to describe the work she did while she was a call student. So Ashley, you're good to go?
Sounds good. And it wasn't just me, it was also Hannah Collier who helped me with this research as well. So the first study that we did in call covered the job analysis of earth science librarians and data managers. Since Hannah and I both have earth science backgrounds coming into call, we thought this would be a useful way to learn more about this interdisciplinary career area. We took the lead on data collection during the spring 2020 semester. We recruited participants through email and in-person interactions using the platforms of atmospheric science librarians and International, ESIP, and then the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. 14 participants responded to our request and were subsequently interviewed individually using Zoom. Each interview was recorded and with the participants' request or consent, and we obtained IRB approval from the University of Tennessee prior to conducting interviews. Each interview was transcribed and then analyzed through an open coding method using NVivo, and findings were published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. And then we'll review the findings in these following slides. All 14 participants held bachelor's degrees with a mixture of STEM and non-STEM disciplines, and all held master's degrees with approximately half in library and information sciences and the remaining half in a STEM discipline. However, there's one participant with a STEM master's degree that shared they were presently taking courses towards a library and information science master's degree. And finally, 3 participants held doctoral degrees in a mixture of disciplines. Next slide. The participants all had various job titles of librarian and manager, such as engineering data librarian or research data manager, along with other titles like project scientist, director, staff, research associate, and research scholar. They currently worked or previously worked in settings such as academic libraries, data repositories, laboratories, and other science agencies. The top common job tasks and skills we identified were communication, collaboration, outreach, teaching and research, and then data-specific tasks. Next slide. The participants were well-versed and diverse in their skill sets, which included various programming languages, various software and frameworks, data carpentry, metadata standards, and information modeling. All participants mentioned the importance of self-education and supplemental training, often to keep up with what their respective populations used. However, they all mentioned a desire for previous educational experiences before starting in their roles. Next slide. On this table, it summarizes the different tools that the participants described during their interviews. These included a variety of programming languages, computer office suites, GIS and database softwares, communication channels, and other various tools. Next slide. And I believe this is where I'll turn over to Hannah.
Yes, thanks, Ashley. So the most common skill that was mentioned by the participants that was important for their job was communication. And all the participants really emphasized this soft skill over others because it's important really in any profession, both in verbal and written forms. It also included kind of people skills in general. They kind of lumped it all together into communication. And a lot of people mentioned like the ability to handle stressful situations, the ability to take on roles outside of their given job, and the ability to adapt. It was kind of all clumped into this idea of communication. And then one important aspect of communication, can you scooch back there? Sorry. One important aspect of communication that was brought up a lot was having an understanding of science, how it works, and what scientists' priorities are, how to talk and engage with scientists formally and informally, and then adapting to their needs. So this kind of helps build a level of trust that's really beneficial to the working relationships between scientists and data managers or librarians. And as one participant said, we're more trying to support the science community rather than doing the real science ourselves. So this ability of communicating with scientists is clearly very important. Next slide, please. And then collaboration was also emerged as a theme as the participants engaged almost daily with various populations such as students, faculty, staff, researchers, but then also with coworkers and peers as well. Through these interactions, they can help determine their population's research needs, implement and support the data lifecycle within their institution. And this skill is also important among teams and groups so that everyone kind of stays on the same page. And then a majority of participants also performed outreach activities, which include informing populations that they exist, kind of marketing their services. And this is often done through organizing programs, presentations, and workshops, as well as attending and presenting at conferences such as this. And then next slide, please. And then teaching and research. I think that's on the next slide. So these are formally not as common of a task, but there were a small amount who taught workshops and even full semester courses. But there were participants who did indicate that their jobs involved teaching kind of more one-on-one users and patrons about what they do, or answering questions about best data management practices. And then there were data-specific tasks that were common as well. Most often these were data curation tasks, such as cleaning data, processing, making data available on websites, and then storing data. And there were some who mentioned how these data-specific tasks were part of a much larger process that involved many people doing either manual or working on automated workflows. So it's apparent how these large multi-step processes would involve a lot of the before mentioned communication and collaboration skills as well. And then next slide, please. And then just overall, we found that the job titles that we came across could mean vastly different things depending on the institution. Often these jobs were named a long time ago and the current incumbents didn't perform the same tasks as when the positions were first designed. And this should be noted to students who are working towards these kind of careers. And then participants had varying education and backgrounds, and there were research data management curriculum gaps. So generally speaking, it seemed that a degree in a STEM field would allow the employee better familiarity with their service population, but an LIS degree often gives them the understanding of data management and the data life cycle, as well as the importance of user experience that is not as prevalent in a STEM field. And then one participant even mentioned how rare it is to find someone who knows all of those things like data management, the science, and then even information technology. And then the importance of communication, again, always important, but often undervalued. So having the ability to communicate to those you work with and those you work for is probably the most important skill for those interviewed. The next slide, please. So while this research was conducted to help kind of inform the development of a core curriculum for earth science data management, for us, it was just great to learn about what different people were doing in this field. And we wanted to use this information we gained from conducting the interviews and preparing the paper to kind of help us personally look for jobs after graduation. So a lot of this information was used to help us determine what skills we should gain and highlight on resumes and in interviews based on what participants said were important in their positions. So we kind of use this to kind of guide our own curriculums that we focused on during our graduate degrees. So for me, these are the aspects that I believe helped me secure the position that I got after graduation, which is a metadata coordinator with the ARM Data Center at ORNL. So both Ashley and I will go kind of over our practicum experiences in more detail on the next slide, but generally having practicum experience helped me develop technical skills and also professional experience. So I believe that the focus on communication and collaboration that was mentioned in the interviews was often kind of pointing towards that ability to work within a professional group setting. So this practicum work experience, as well as just past professional experience, was especially important and ought to be considered when preparing a curriculum. And then information science courses often contain kind of open-ended projects that allow students to cultivate and use whichever technical skills they wish to learn. So I thought this was extremely helpful, just having the ability to work on a project using tools such as R or Python or even Tableau or just whatever you want it to use so that you can initiate the learning of these skills that you want to either use in your current job or in your future career. And just the education of the importance of open data, the fair data principles within the sciences, I think was an important aspect to my employer and to my current job. And then I would also kind of just like to point out that the education gaps that I've noticed as I've started my new job, just kind of a gap in knowing about atmospheric science that I've been trying to fill in since my background is more in geology. So there's a lot of things I'm learning there, as well as learning about working in Unix environments and using the command line interface. Then I'll pass it back over to Ashley.
Like Hannah mentioned, I agree that communication and collaboration skills are necessary to emphasize in both educational and professional settings. Proficiency in these areas are just as important as many other soft skills. I found that during the only job interview that I had during my job hunt, that highlighting communication, collaboration, in addition to adaptability, flexibility, intuitiveness, and honesty, and then demonstrating interest and efforts in interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary fields displayed an overall positive conception of my character and personality. So then my now current boss felt very confident to hire me. He's a forward thinker, so he saw a new hire who could help change the perspective of our library at our institution through teaching, collaboration, and outreach. And then on this slide, I emphasize diversity and perspective because I found that played to my advantage in my role, because at my current institution, I'm in rural Kentucky, and I belong to a small population of non-natives, meaning that I have no affiliation to this area or to the college. And in addition, I now belong to a small but growing population of the millennial generation in a mix of a large presence of baby boomers and Generation X. So it's fascinating how these characteristics can bring diversity and perspective to this type of college. And then as a student, it's also hard to sell yourself to employers seeking certain characteristics usually belong to those already in the workforce. And I found that highlighting the skills and experiences I obtained through my coursework at University of Tennessee were just as valuable because they can be considered actual experience depending on who the hiring manager is you're speaking with. My then future boss had inquired me during my interview about what I didn't know and what I didn't know, so he could focus on those things if and when I started in my position. And then that's also where the practicums and internships come into play as well, providing professional experiences in a controlled environment. We can go to the next slide. It's back to you, Hannah.
Yeah, just to go a bit further into detail about our practicum experiences, having a practicum was a requirement of the call program that we were in, which was important for us to help build our professional resumes with work that was actually in the field. So for me, I did 2 semesters with ORAL, which is Oak Ridge Associated Universities, in the research division. And I worked on a project using Python scripting to match professional resumes of peer reviewers to project proposals. So through this project, I was able to learn a lot about not only Python, but machine learning and natural language processing, and then just working on problem solving abilities, as well as working with professionals outside of the university setting was really beneficial.
For me, I had 2 separate virtual practicum placements. I spent my first semester with the International Soil Carbon Network under Kathy Todd Brown. I was one of the grad students she recruited to try and help the data problem that she had mentioned during this morning's session. Unfortunately, I was not as successful, but I hope the work that I worked on could help solve the data problem there. My second semester I spent with NCAR, working with Don Stott, Greg Stossmeister, and Matt Marinick. And then the idea for both of these placements was to understand and work with the information science behind earth science data, since my background was in meteorology and I was presently learning about information sciences. In both placements, we focused on working mainly with technical and data-specific skills like programming and metadata creation, and then exercising quantitative and qualitative analyses. Though I don't use the hard skills regularly in my current position now, I have knowledge and understanding of these concepts, so that way I could apply them to future projects in both my current position and any future positions I may hold. And we could go to the next slide.
So yeah, thank you all so much. Very, very exciting, and just reviewing how important the practicum placement is, knowing that there's still coursework related to any degree, but knowing how much you actually learn on the job. We definitely had really great placements. So thank you so much for anybody who was hosting a student out there. Some of our collaborators on call were also ORNL, Oak Ridge National Lab, and the USGS has hosting a lot of our students now that are in the second cohort. But great work by Ashley and Hannah throughout the program, doing both research and learning some skills to help with their employment, and you got jobs. So that's the best outcome we can hope for. The past study of ESIP, very similar to what Hannah and Ashley just explained, so I won't go over it in much detail other than the fact that at this point, I've talked to a lot of people, done a lot of interviews, really systematic qualitative research, and I was confident enough that this time around we could do a survey validation. Just to review, a survey validation just takes the common responses from the interview studies and then sort of makes it more generalizable, things that people can tick off and in a survey format instead of giving other examples that might not work as common responses. We still had an option of other each time, and quite a few people still had things, sort of a long tail of tasks that were not yet captured, but I think enough people checked off the common responses for this particular study to show that this is what people are actually doing. It's another step to turn that into curriculum, but this was sort of a nice step along the job analysis process. Thank you so much. We had 55 responses from the ESIP membership list. That is the only recruitment we did for this survey, was to send it out to ESIP a couple times last year. And so just some highlights real quick, because I want to spend most of our time interacting and having discussion on perspectives of educators and employers. But not surprisingly, since it was ESIP, 78% were working in government or higher education or both. Almost 70% had a master's degree or higher. And, you know, 3/4 worked with earth science data for at least a decade. So that is still a reflection of who's attending, who's participating, but a lot of people have been working with earth science for a long time who participated. For some of the common communication tasks identified in earlier interview studies, communicating with other data managers, a big part of the job, talking to scientists. A lot of those people are doing many different roles too, so it could be checking off all of these being the same person, but most of this communication is discussing data with other data managers and scientists. Certainly there's a lot of other long list here of other people that are discussing, you're communicating with all the time, right? Collaboration, connecting individuals with expert in data services was something that came up a lot. Most people also saying they discuss projects or tasks within their research team. So that collaboration is a constant with any job. So not too surprising there. For outreach tasks, this had a little more variety, but basically just like now, attending presentations, giving presentations, going to webinars, workshops, networking at conferences, something that everybody's doing, and that's also part of the job, is sort of continuing education, even if it's not formal, is always going on through participating in different task force and committees and all kinds of things. A few other outreach tasks were also mentioned, not too exciting there. But the time is also an interesting part of the job analysis for me, at least, is how often is this happening? Obviously communication is happening at all jobs all the time. So that wasn't surprising that came up as a daily basis. Collaboration, not as much. People were checking a less frequency, and only 26% reporting daily basis of outreach activities. So I guess it depends on your role and what you're expected to do as part of your job, if some of those activities and tasks would show up every day. But 90% of people said that some of the outreach tasks were happening monthly at least. So everyone has a little bit of outreach in all of their jobs. For teaching and learning, you know, it's the lifelong learning with any of these information agencies, any of these professions, to keep track with trends and changes in data and standards. You know, you gotta attend and keep learning well beyond any formal education. People mentioned all of these different things and a long list again of other steps that they were dealing with. Very few taking credit hour courses. Obviously, a lot you can learn plenty without having to pay for it. So, you know, in a credit hour basis, at least. Research tasks. Many people were doing data management plan implementation. They were helping people with their data management plans, making sure that they were working, publishing data, creating them, publishing articles. These are some common research tasks that I'm sure everybody has from time to time as part of their jobs. Then a long tail of data specific tasks also were asked. People are creating metadata, answering questions about data all the time from users. And depending on your role, you might not think of that as sort of a reference interview from traditional librarianship, but the more I talk to people in data, a lot of these same like theoretical frameworks and ways to study information seeking behavior and interpersonal communication are very similar to asking a librarian for help, just as an aside. Managing data resource, so if you're actually running a repository or a data center, doing some quality control, quality assurance, all kinds of checks on data, locating data, all of this stuff. And this is a lot to fit into one class or one program, especially when you start listing all the programming languages people mentioned. Obviously, there's the common ones, Python, some R, XML, scripting. I don't want to get into the debate of which is which, but, there's a lot, a really, really long list of all the things that no one could possibly, be a master at, but at least be aware of. The software and tools mentioned, a lot of people mentioning Jupyter Notebooks now, GIS. A lot of other things came up too that were mentioned more infrequently, but you can see it's a lot of software, a lot of tools to keep track of. Excuse me, 92% engage with data on at least a weekly basis. That is not surprising for the ESIP community at all. And just to summarize what we sort of learned through the survey validation, no surprises, but there's the metadata creation and all the standards are just common responsibilities, any part of data, handling it, cleaning it. Many of the tools are diverse. So depending on where you work, you need some dexterity, learning new things quickly, being aware of changes and different requirements, but also user preferences. It depends on where you're working and who you're working with, for data integration. But that obviously any single tool would be very difficult to make any of this work, which makes it tough for curriculum too, to keep up with things that are changing all the time. But there's some definite commonalities throughout all these studies, and that's simply, the soft skills and some of the management stuff are very important regardless of technical changes over time. Peter, I'm sure you have more on the educator perspective, how to distill everything that we learned by studying these jobs and studying people to actually, what do you cover in, a quarter out of Denver?
Yeah, thank you, Wade, and thank you, Hannah and Ashley. So let me just introduce myself briefly, because this is my first CSIP. I'm a professor in library information science at the University of Denver, and I'm just really enjoying. We're only second session in, but I'm really enjoying my time here. I work in text mining and large digital libraries, if anybody's curious. As an educator, I want to share some initial thoughts on some of this emerging work, noting that it's still going on, right? So we're partway through this grant. But one of the things that I find really notable, especially in the work that Wade just showed, is the palpability of it. So I actually find, as an educator, one of the primary resistances to things like teaching tools of the trade is actually communicating the value to students. Often it's hard to bridge the gap between, oh, this is the thing you do in class, and then this is something that's legitimately valued in the workplace. I teach things like Jupyter and OpenRefine and Pandas and Python. And I think often there's this perception in the classroom where, oh, this is just that thing the teacher, the professor teaches you. And I actually spend a lot of time seeking out job analyses like this. So I'm glad to see, see movement in developing more. The other difficulty is communicating the different styles of similar tools that people may need to know, right? So what I mean by that is it's hard to justify to students or to make curricular decisions on things like, should we be teaching in R or Python, right? Students often expect the one right way to do it. And as Wade just showed, that's not really, that doesn't really reflect the litany of approaches that you might encounter in the real world. It's really fascinating how, in that specific example, I mentioned R and Python because they're almost equal. And then Jupyter and RStudio were almost equal. Further, that desire to teach the one right tool overlooks that more general, overlooks the more general conceptual understanding of how something works, right? So there are different ways to clean a data set or crunch summary statistics or plot a trend line. As educators, oftentimes we're actually trying to abstract away from that. So sure, I taught you this tool, but really here's the underlying thing you're doing. And hopefully that'll make switching to an alternate tool. Thanks for the comment, Wade. So switching to an alternate tool is easier once you understand what you're doing rather than, oh, I just went and I clicked this and this and this. So I'm really interested in hearing the reflection both from educators and practitioners in the audience. Studies like this help inform what we teach, but they also give us evidence for communicating to students why we make these decisions. It's great to have a needs assessment that's greater than just, oh, I went to a conference and I observed this myself, right? At the same time, I have seen, there are some students in the audience, and I'm really interested in the student perspective, because one thing we very quickly forget as we move further and further away from our training is just how tough it is to be a student, right? You have no time. You're working on a lot of things. So I love this student perspective and considering, how do you prioritize what you're teaching? Because if any of you are in the audience are current students, you probably don't want us to just keep increasing and increasing, because that just means it makes it harder to do everything, right? I have two final reactions before handing it off, and I'm passively tracking the chat, and I will return to that shortly. One was the importance of soft skills that Hannah and Ashley talked about. The sort of intangibles, and we see that in many places. I think part of that is something that we'll see more in this grant as we continue. As Ashley and Hannah reported, a necessary part of the students participating in the call grant is the practicum. And Ashley and Hannah are giving us great feedback about the value of that practicum in subsequently going out and understanding, how things really work. The way the grant was structured, there's a much bigger cohort that's going into practicums in the upcoming year. So we look forward to hearing from more students and more soon-to-be professionals in that grant. And then my final reaction is just to this emerging research is the curiosity about the relative values of important skills, right? So, as a professor, and many of you may agree here, I immensely appreciate the approach that Wade and Hannah and Ashley take of, planning a professional degree by going to the professionals, right? But we also know that there's more complexity to it. And I look forward to hearing from Matt and the other attendees, right? Not everything needs to be taught in your graduate program. Some things you learn on the job. Some things, if you don't, some emerging skills you train for, right? So I'm curious as we move on and listen both to our students and the professionals here and in other venues, you know, what are the skills that you train for, and what are the ones that you try when you can get funding to hire for? So with that, I'll yield my time. Wade, would you like to move on to Matt, or should we turn to discussion now? How are you imagining this?
Great comments coming in the chat. A lot of other good questions too for us all to consider. But thanks, Peter. I think that gives more context. We just want to use this time to make sure that everyone has a say and gets some input here on what would be better. How do we always improve what we're doing already, and getting that feedback loop is not always there for all of education, unfortunately.
Perfect. So we'll turn to a broader group discussion shortly. But for now, let's hand it off to Matt Marinick.
All right. Thank you, Peter and Wade, and thank you everybody for coming to the session. It's been really thought-provoking for sure. I'm, as Wade said at the beginning, I've been involved as a sort of a external advisor to a certain extent for the CALL program, as well as being an internship mentor. So I'm aware of it, but haven't been quite as involved in the details as the other folks so far. So I'm going to provide a couple comments, as it says here, sort of from an employer perspective, but I do have, I think, multiple takes on some of these. I work professionally at NCAR as a project scientist is my official title. Research data services specialist is my unofficial title, and I'll come back to the topic of job titles shortly here. So I have a role in coordinating and enacting data services at NCAR, but I also serve as a researcher for some of these topics. And as I said, I've mentored a number of internships from library and information science students in the past. And I've also taught a data curation course actually in Peter's program a couple times, including the most recent time it was taught since Peter was unavailable to teach it. So I'm going to provide comments across a few of those categories. And where I'm going to start is, I think what's interesting about a lot of what's been presented so far is that it's not a single job type. There are really multiple classes of job types in sort of this data ecosystem. And if I try to group them a little bit, there's sort of the hands-on data management role, right, where you're actually the sort of data manager, the data curator, and your job is to work with scientists and put the data in a package, create the metadata, put it in repository, and perhaps some other roles related to that. Then there's the technical role, right, of building systems, whether it's the databases or the metadata structures or the pipelines to move things around. There's a liaison and a coordination role, right, which is sort of making sure the pieces fit together, even if you're not doing any of the pieces. And to a certain extent, that's probably the best description of my role at NCAR. And then there's a management role, right, which is you're somebody who's maybe not doing any of those things, but your job is to sort of making sure that they're all happening with within the budgets and so on. And of course, many jobs do have multiple of these components in them, and certainly many job descriptions in this area include more than one of those roles. But I think that's just one thing I want to sort of call out, is that there's many kinds of roles within this type of work. But I think what's notable to me, at least just the first thing that comes to my mind when looking at these results is the importance of communication comes across in all of these roles. And I think this was emphasized by almost every speaker already. And certainly, as an employer who's been involved in a number of job searches across some of these types of job categories, that's always maybe not the top consideration, but certainly 1A, 1B, if it's not the very top, which is, will these candidates for whatever position be able to communicate with the relevant stakeholders, whether it's the scientists who are creating the data or leadership or both, be able to communicate effectively, right? So, it's a common thought sort of experiment, right? Will this person be able to be in a meeting with scientist X, right? Or will they be able to go into the lab meeting for group X and present whether it's a project or, a database or what have you. So that really resonated, I think, with my experience there. And I think what's interesting about that communication aspect is it ties in then to this question of what's the disciplinary expertise that these candidates may have. And Hannah certainly touched on this, and I think Wade as well. And this is a common question that I get from students that I've worked with, both internships or with courses. Do you need the domain science expertise to work in a repository related to that domain? And I think the answer is no, but it helps. And there's a distinction, I think, in some different kinds of expertise that I've seen come from the sociology of science, where people have studied expertise where there's contributory expertise where you can contribute to the science, right? You can sort of do the science in the same way that the scientists are doing. And then there's interactional expertise, where the idea is you can interact with people, you can understand the words that they're using, you understand the sort of social and institutional worlds that people live in, in the sort of science world, even if you can't do the work they're doing, right? And so my personal example is that, I have no ability to run a weather model or climate model. I've never done that in my life, but I spend a lot of time talking to people who do that. And then hopefully, at least from my point of view, mostly effectively. So I would say I have a lot of interactional expertise in working with people who do these kinds of models, but I have no contributory expertise, right? I could never, certainly not in the short term, do that myself without a lot of additional training. And I think that's one of the tricks to, looking for people in the data management space is, what are the skills we need and what are the kinds of expertise we need? And disciplinary expertise is often sort of a shorthand for the interactional expertise, right? Well, this person has an earth science degree, so we expect they would be able to talk to an earth scientist. I think especially people on hiring committees who are themselves earth scientists have that perspective. And so sometimes people who have different backgrounds, who may have everything else that's relevant, may sometimes not get the look that they deserve or might need, but for whatever reason, that's really valued. The next thing I just want to touch quickly on job titles. I think it's always interesting, just as a reflection on NCAR, because we have no official job titles in our large taxonomy of job titles that have the word data in them. So anybody who's working with data, either you're a one-off job title, you're the only one in your job title, or you're like a scientist, or you're a computer scientist or a software engineer. We have multiple job titles for scientists, right? There's an associate scientist and a project scientist, and but I think there's no, maybe it's just been added very recently, like a data engineer job category. So I think that's an area where employers are sort of behind the curve in terms of where the jobs are really needed and where they're actually working. Because there is different types of expertise needed for, say, software engineering on data systems and software engineering on other kinds of systems. But I think it's also a reflection of kind of the P word, which we haven't said yet, but which is profession, right? Is this data work a profession, or is it multiple professions? Is it not a profession? And that's a bit of a Pandora's box, but I think that the job title diversity reflects that it's not a distinct profession yet, right? There's not a doctor, right, or a lawyer, or even a plumber, right, that are very distinct professions. And I think maybe the last thing I'll reflect on here is one of the things that's really interesting about what Ashley presented in particular, all the different degrees that people have is, and I think this is really interesting about ESIP as well, is there's lots of different career journeys that people have taken to become a data professional in one of these roles. And I think it's a really distinctive and fascinating thing about coming to ESIP, right? You talk to people and everyone has a different story about how they came to this community and how they came to their work. And again, this is reflected in I think some of Hannah's comments about what scientists and computer scientists bring to these jobs versus maybe information science students kind of coming right out of their schools. And what we've experienced in previous programs like the CALL program here is that the scientists or the computer scientists who come to these kind of early career jobs tend to have the technical skills, or that's something that they have more of emphasized in their education, and then sort of how their individual skills fits into the big picture of the life cycle, of data life cycle and so on is sort of what needs to be built up over time in their job. Whereas the information science students tend to have the sort of inverse of that, which is they come in with a strong understanding of the idea of the life cycle the various pieces and how they fit together. But the specific technical skills, as Peter said, tend to be less emphasized, or maybe not quite the exact ones that employers are looking for in this particular space. So again, it's not that either is better, it's just a different thing. And so when hiring, you need to think about, given the sort of suite of skills that might be needed and what these candidates have, where are you able to spend your time with the on-the-job training versus where maybe you can't, and does that influence how you hire people? But I maybe just ask one more kind of conceptual question that I'd be interested in having lots of input from anybody else on the session is, I think it is distinctive to have this sort of mix of backgrounds, right? And so there's, to me, a conceptual question about what are the benefits or drawbacks of that, and to think about the other side, like if it was to become a more consistent thing where everyone in the sort of ESIP world, just for the sake of argument, had a more consistent educational background, what would be lost in that context? And Ashley made the comment about diversity and sort of different perspectives. And I think that's a really valuable aspect of ESIP, is the diversity of perspectives. And so again, it's not that I think it'd be good or bad, I just kind of put that out as a thought question. What would be the benefits or drawbacks of having more consistency? And would there be anything lost in that sort of shift? So I'll stop there, Wade, and I'll turn it back to you on how you want to get the discussion session going.
Sure. There's pretty just a lot of great questions already in the chat. So if it's okay, just to address some of them, and maybe that'll get us going. I guess all the great comments, really thought-provoking stuff. I don't know which one to start with. So do any of the chat questions speak to any particular speaker? Mike Daniels says, I think it's often difficult, impossible to find a person that matches the exact needs. That's true, I think, of anywhere, but especially in these professions. It's very tough that the ideal job description person does not exist. So you kind of mold whoever you get, and the job changes too based on who's there. So that's a good thought. Paul Lemieux had a question, and he said, did you look at what degrees were most in demand? Pretty much. Paul, thanks for that question, because it's not something we looked at. I was not looking at job descriptions. I know Hannah Collier did a little bit of work on some job descriptions. I don't know did they mention certain degrees?
Yeah, for the ones that I was looking at, more data, hands-on data roles, a lot of them were looking more for like a computer science degree, which I thought was interesting. I did notice that employers that were more local to Knoxville and had worked with UT and the information science department might put on their job postings, we're looking for information scientists, but it wasn't something common that I saw in a lot of the data related roles that I looked at.
Thank you. And I know kind of the job of her professors tying some things together, so it's not intentional, but I realize I'm doing it. Tyler says then there's this data science job sort of title movement, but not all these things that we actually still need, like data management, curation, archiving, governance, those at least tasks and duties are falling to people with different job titles. So that's always a fun conversation too, to see, is there a role for ESIP in all of this? Especially some of Matt's comments, some of Peter's comments. What could ESIP do to continue this? Or is it great the way it is? We just have a diversity of ideas, people from all different areas, and we learn a lot and just love the meetings.
Wade, can I jump in on that one just quickly here? I've worked a little bit with our UCAR Human Resources Department, and anything on the official job title stuff is something that's been vetted and approved and gone through HR, right? And so one of the challenges there is for a change to be made like this, you have to make a case that it's an actual thing, right? And so there's sort of a chicken and egg problem, is you can't make a case for something if it doesn't exist, but something won't exist until you make a case for it. And so that's, I think, a big challenge in this area. And so, I appreciate this comment from Tyler that this is the same issue with the federal government, right? Somebody's got to be first, and until that happens, ideally it'd be the government, because they're the kind of the big dog that would push a lot of influence elsewhere. But I think that's the big challenge is, until it's rolling, there's human resources people are conservative for any good reasons in terms of these kinds of things.
You're muted, Dr. Bishop.
I didn't notice a lot of time devoted to learning new skills in the survey. I kind of put those all under the teaching and learning section. So it wasn't something quantifiable, like how much time you spend learning something new is not something that would lend itself to a survey. I really enjoy qualitative research. It just takes forever because of the coding and transcription, and it's a much more rich data set, but it's not generalizable. And sciences, that's always the gold standard, is we want something that's actually not just 12 people, but hundreds of people if we can, especially when we're trying to inform curriculum, not just a UT, but beyond. So hopefully that answers the question, but yeah, it's tough. How much can you build in for any job that includes the learning that must occur on the job?
Can I address a question from Kathy that happened during the session? This wasn't by one of the participants, but they had mentioned one of their coworkers. They had the title of data visualization librarian. So they did nothing regarding librarian tasks. They were just there to help students with software programs like Tableau and blanking on some of the other data visualization softwares out there. But basically that person was there just in the event that people needed help with visualizing their data.
One of the thing I'll come back to is the question of communication and how you learn that. And I'd be interested in Peter's thought on this, but I know certainly in the library and information sciences, but you don't have a course on communication. I mean, there are courses on like, reference librarianship, which is maybe the closest thing where you learn about sort of interacting with potential patrons. And I think there's an aspect of that that's I think relevant here. But is there a way to teach communication in a general way, right, that's not sort of hokey and really canned? And as I mentioned, I did teach the data curation course at the University of Denver this past spring, and I thought about this a fair amount, and I tried to tell the students, which is one way you say, communication is important, but that it's not really super helpful itself. But one sort of idea I had, which I think worked pretty well, is that I set up a couple guest speakers from data types that I was not familiar with, I had no knowledge of, right? One was like social media data, one was drone data, which was really interesting, and there was a third one. And I tried to model, and I tried to explain to students this too. This is how I would go about having a conversation with this person about their data, right? And I have very little background. And so I sort of prepared a question, a set of questions I would have, and I distributed that to the students. So maybe I'll turn to Peter, but the communication thing, how does that fit into a program, and how do you teach that, given that it's pretty clear from these results that that's one of the top things that people are needing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd also love to turn to the participants. I think it's okay to unmute unless that's against the code of conduct. So if other people want to jump in verbally in addition to that chat, you're welcome. I think that comes down to certain pedagogical choices to an extent, because I think it's really tough to learn, but it's something that is done in law, is done in business, and I think it's more that it requires a specialized expertise that you don't see in library schools and information science schools, and in some scientific programs you might see it, but it's actually finding the expertise to teaching it properly. I know my own pedagogical approach to grad school is that like from day one, every single assignment should focus on good written communication. So I actually grade a lot around, we're not writing very beautiful essays, which, which are fun for a professor to read, maybe. We're writing for a reader in a hurry. So how do we convince them we're moving on? How do we break our arguments that don't expect that somebody will read a 10-page paper before getting to the end of it? but verbal communication is much trickier. And I think some of that, fairly or not, we sort of outsource that to external context, right? So internships and practicums and things like that. Yeah, so if other people have thoughts, that's a great question.
There's so many good comments too in the chat. So if anybody would rather unmute, that would be maybe helpful, because some of these are kind of lengthy. But I guess I should say that everything from this study informed a course I taught in the spring semester called Science Liaison Librarianship. It will obviously cover things that would be applicable to any job outside of libraries as well. But we had a whole week on soft skills, and I felt pretty silly, honestly, teaching that, but it was pretty useful to just review some of the research that's out there and what you can do to, just brush up on some of the things you should assume everyone already knows, but might not. You can get to grad school without having soft skills, apparently. We had interviews with people in the profession. I had actually students do ethnography work. They did an ethnography of some science community. I think that was very helpful to sort of embed themselves and learn as much as they could. Those are some of the pedagogical choices I made, but there's a lot of ways to teach this stuff. And of course, this entire last year, we've been doing everything at a distance. So that's a whole other wrinkle in the communication piece. But I've seen a lot of comments. Does anybody want to review some of them?
I want to actually, Brad, this is Kathy Fontaine. I've been sitting here dumping comments in, sorry. I am at RPI. I am a longtime ESIP member. This is not my first rodeo. Some of you I know. Hi, guys. One of the things that we found in our data science work here at RPI, both graduate and undergraduate, is that teaching only the skill that is required to do the job takes it out of context. And that context and the broader picture is really, really critical to getting the point across. And it's critical to the learning. For our master's program in IT, which is a data science heavy curriculum, the students are required to do internships and partnerships and projects with local corporations. Local for us in Troy, New York, meaning down in New York City or over in Boston. And those projects always require the students to take what they've learned and kind of put that in the back and sit and listen to what actually the customer wants or what the customer thinks they want, and then try and discuss that until you get a good outcome. And then the skill set comes in. But, and we have these group projects, individual projects. I do a critical thinking unit in my policy course. The requirement that these people talk to each other, which is foreign to some of us, but they talk to each other and they do cooperative projects and they each present their portion of it. And the requirement that we provide a context for all the skills that they're using, I think helps them understand the value of what it is they're learning and how they can incorporate that into any job in the future. I will stop there.
Yeah, I think that point, Kathy, is really important about the context, and I think related to Peter's comment earlier about there are some types of professions or educational programs that do teach communication, like law and business, and that just reminded me that I was at a conference a few years ago, and there was a person from a law library there, and he was a trained lawyer in addition to being a librarian, and his mode of presenting was so different than everyone else's. I mean, I don't know how else to say it besides he spoke like a lawyer. Like it was clear as he was talking. I was like, wow, there's a certain way that he's been trained to speak, which is very different from the way I've been trained to speak. And he was clearly building a case, right? And he was talking about librarianship, but he was building a case, right? He had sort of an overarching narrative that he was clearly trying to tell. And he had 3 key points that he emphasized, 6 times throughout the talk. And he kind of kept coming back to his main sort of story that he was telling. And I think that's kind of, we all exist in these contexts, right? And so to take these skills out of the context even communication, it's difficult to understand how they all fit together.
And so I was the one that also posted the question, what's the most non-traditional skill you learned that is useful to you? And for me, it was actually a facilitation training I took way back 25, 30 years ago. Learning how to be a facilitator actually is, I can't tell you the number of arguments that I've diffused. You're welcome, Peter. And the number of times I went, thank God I knew how to ask the, what would you like from this? What outcome would you like from this meeting question? But I'm always fascinated to see what weird non-traditional skill, speaking of context, came in with you that was really, really useful to you.
Well, I'll respond to that, but I'm interested in others on the call. I think one thing that has really been striking to me, or that's really come to my attention, is, again, I'm not a technology person in terms of my work, but I always need to be engaging with technology. And so I think the skill is learning how to learn about tools and what they do, right? So I'm never going to be the one who's installing, or deploying my data to the cloud. But I need to learn about how the cloud works so that I can work with those people and I can talk with those people and understand from a management point of view if we should be looking at cloud-based systems, and likewise with databases and interfaces and scripting and all of this type of thing. So for me, it's learning about how to learn about tools.
I do want to remind everyone to make sure we're capturing this stuff, this great stuff in the Zoom chat, but we have the other document as well to sort of populate, and a few guiding questions. Sorry, Peter, I was just reading your comment. Yeah, I don't know. Thanks, Matt. Anybody else have some other things they learned that are helpful? I guess juggling doesn't count.
Ordering pizza counts.
Kathy, to your question, I think before I got into this graduate program, I was environmental consultant. I did a lot of field work. So taking notes while in the field, like kind of tracking what I'm doing all day, has been so helpful to everything. Like just being able to like organize and track and make notes is like the most helpful thing in the world, I think.
Yeah, excellent. We have a grad student here who has a passion for archaeology, and she wants to apply AI to archaeology. And she comes into the data science world with a completely different mindset. She's thinking about relationships of civilizations to each other, people to each other. She's thinking in terms of how one artifact relates to another artifact, or which one came first, or which one was a version of the other one. And you can sometimes see when the other students are talking with her that they're like, what are you talking about? What? how? I don't understand. So it's thinking about even the way people think about a problem could be a non-traditional skill that they come in with.
Thank you, Kathy. I also want to know Sarah's response on project management. That actually, I was talking about that with my partner, who's a project manager, the other day. In our fields, we definitely underhire project managers. So if we don't have dedicated project managers, at the very least, I absolutely agree. We need more project management experience amongst ourselves. In my area in academia, everything's run by people that have no training in how to run anything, which is difficult. yeah, I think Chantel also managed project or mentioned project management. Just catching up on the chat here.
Well, one thing too, with just thinking about project management is it comes up just in order to be successful, because there's so many different aspects of the job that you have to figure out, well, what's the priority and what's the I don't want to say the most important, but sometimes something might be due soon, but it's not as important as something that makes sure the organization that you're part of is succeeding. And so those can be skills that some people just don't have that broad view. And it is a skill that you can either you can go through training and maybe you could just learn it. And some people it's an innate skill, but if your organization doesn't have someone in that position, right, where does it get communicated that it's also an expectation as part of the job?
Thank you. Sorry.
No, great. Those are good comments there. I just noted that Howard has hand up, so I want to make sure and hear from him too. But to your point, yes, it's whoever is there already, whatever skills they have, what do you need to figure out is really contextual. Everyone learns in different ways too. So there's a lot of factors here. Howard, go ahead with your question. Thanks.
Yeah, I've also been with the Federation for a while. I'm a neuroscientist, and I became vice president of the Federation just because I was working with NASA on a astronaut neuromuscular junction problem, and I was building image grammars. So I think as you look to the future, don't think you know what the job's going to be that you're going to do the rest of your life. I recommend philosophy, and I really recommend general library stuff. American Library Association is just ripe for interaction with educators and people who understand how to catalog things. I mean, we have a lot of things in the library, many of which have environmental implications. The library is where the rubber meets the road. If you want to have an impact on society, they're trusted. Nobody else right now is trusted.
Thanks, Howard. Yeah, there's the connections across organizations are interesting because we're all working in sort of interstitial spaces between domains. And then it's interesting that there's a universe of people like that that are connected in these different ways too. I was just reflecting, my first ESIP, I was shocked there wasn't already some education cluster that dealt with this part of education. The education cluster deals with K-12, which is so critical now, teaching those things. But as a, someone in teaching graduate students mostly, it'd be great if there was a cluster around that. Maybe not, maybe just tack on educational pieces to other clusters, but just a thought there.
I guess I just want to make a comment on Chantel's response in the chat about translating between users and scientists, because that's one of the reasons why I got into this profession, is because as a meteorology student, you realize that you really needed to figure out how to make this very technical science understandable to the 5th grade reading level, which can be hard to do. And then, yeah, that's pretty much why, because then you find out that there's a lot of communication gaps, and especially when it comes to dealing with different emergencies and disasters, whether they're weather related or not. So figuring out how to close those communication gaps is really vital.
I guess turning back to some of the prompts that we had in the beginning, and maybe this will help if everyone could just share something they wish they knew that they didn't, that did not come up in any of their education, that would have helped them in their career, that you had to learn on the job, but maybe it could have been communicated earlier. there's some good ones coming in the chat, but if anyone else wants to just talk through something, we've got a small enough group to do that too.
I guess one thing I wish I learned is how to conduct a reference interview, because I never really did it in any of my past experiences working in a library as a student. And now that I'm a librarian myself, I haven't had the chance to interact with students from the other side of the fence. So I wish I kind of had that practice. I'm grateful that my boss is trying to exercise me before school starts. That's something I wish I knew before starting my job.
Yeah, that's something that a few people will definitely mention in chat as being a transferable skill. As someone, we have ALA accreditation, that's the American Library Association accreditation, and we sort of had to cut a few things to get the right amount of stuff that fits into the credit hours we have. So actually it just hurts me to say, like, yes, I used to teach that class and we used to require that class, and brilliant people thought, oh, we need a required IT course because IT is much more important than talking to people. So there you go.
That's a good point that Sarah put in about responding to the comment on knowing how to run a meeting. I don't know how to run a meeting, but the little parenthetical, having a note taker that it's not just the youngest woman in the room. I think more generally, just DI considerations like that are important, and I think there's research showing difficulties in workplaces where you don't, where the buck for administrative tasks doesn't automatically move on. When you end up in situations in a workplace that end up being volunteer tokens, okay, I'll do this, I'll volunteer for this committee. That's where various that's where inequities enter the workplace. So actually, thinking again from the education side, I think that's something we should be instilling more in people, the sort of practices that help avoid unequal workplaces, like making sure everybody gets their turn on committees, rather than everybody gets to choose whether they want to be on a committee. Oh, and yeah, plus for me also on budgets, grant writing, again, direct, clear communication.
Maybe I'll bring up a slightly different topic, which is about, wonder if people have experience with skills that maybe used to be common, but now are not common anymore, but are still necessary. And a couple that I'm thinking of is at NCAR, I've been in many conversations where, we need Fortran programmers, and people don't get learn Fortran in computer science programs anymore. But it's still, at the core of climate modeling and a number of other types of modeling. And then of course the data processing that's associated with that. I think XML as well is not being pushed out, but I'm starting to see it certainly be de-emphasized from over JSON or under JSON and things like that. And students who are coming through, especially if they're interested in web programming, are much more interested in working with JSON than XML. So I'm curious if people have experiences with skills that they think are important and they need, but they're sort of not finding a market for it, so to speak.
Wade, maybe we can move to Mike. It looks like he has his hand up. Oh
yeah, thanks, Mike. And Matt, I just don't want to lose Matt's thought there too. That what's missing? What are any long list of things there too? But go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Yeah. I also don't want to miss Matt's point, so I'll try to remember to bring that back. But yeah, I was just wondering. We're talking about all the skills that we don't have and that we need. We need communication. We need programming. We need all these different skills, and I wonder sometimes if it's better to include experts into our teams. And I mean, I was in management, and I went to many small research teams, and I saw they had very little time to be experts at, let's say, software engineering, right? And I looked at their processes and workflows, and I thought, oh gosh, if I could just send one software engineer for a month, I could probably improve their productivity by 30%, you know, looking at it from that perspective. And, you know, at the same time, we have computer science people who are attracted by Google's and Amazon's, you know, they're being pulled away from sciences. And so I think, you know, by including a computer science expert, let's say, or a software engineer, we could show them what this kind of work is like. And it's very interesting, of course. And so that could kind of have a double effect there, both bringing new people into the sciences who have expertise that we need, and then improving the level of sophistication of the data teams and the science teams. And then back on Matt's question about the skills that are missing.
Thanks, Mike. I think a lot of what we're talking about is teaming and having different specializations and realizing that this, you know, curriculum for earth science data managers might actually be 5 or 6 different jobs.
Well, I'm going to go back to actually something that Mike said, I think way early on in the chat. I probably couldn't find it again, but and your point about small teams, Mike, I think is really important. You know, we all have limited budgets and we can only hire so many people. You know, if you're doing good, you have 10 people. You know, depending on what size your unit is. And so my observation has been that the directions of the team tend to be dictated by who you hire rather than the other way around. Right? What I mean is, you know, you may have something you need a new person to do, or, you know, a new hire to do. But I think you made the comment earlier, Mike, that you hire for aptitude and sort of ability to self-advance more than a specific skill. Because, you know, the specific skill that you need in the next year or two is great, but if you hire somebody, you're going to have them hopefully a lot longer, and they can take you forward in whatever directions they think is best. And if you're in this small team context, right, the responsibilities get mushy. It's either they're very distinct or they're very mushy because, you know, you need some backup, and so everyone's kind of doing a little bit of a lot of things. And so, yeah, I think the aptitude aspect really comes to the fore in that context, where, you know, whoever you hire is really going to dictate where you go, not as much what skills you need.
Well put, Matt. I guess for anybody who has any final questions for any of us, just thank you so much again for letting us share what we've been working on. Hopefully it's useful beyond just our little grant, but it's good to have a longer conversation, maybe beyond this one session, to see what's the next steps for anybody and what would be a good collaboration going forward. And as Peter mentioned, I got a no-cost extension, so there's actually 2 more years of the call grant. So you might see us next summer with some new findings. But did anyone else have sort of parting shots, final thoughts, last questions? It's always a fun conversation, and I continue on into the coffee break or wherever normally. But I just wanted to say thanks for everybody's input and things. But I always still that project management hat of like, okay, what is our actual takeaway? What's our next step? So we've made great use of all our time here. Anybody have thoughts on what that might be? Could this be useful to continue on or study different communities? Maybe craft out different roles. I know Nancy shared a great resource earlier. That's a great point, Sarah. So having just, because I see job descriptions that are just ridiculous for these super people that don't exist. So maybe some recommendations on how to scope that, or what to include, how to keep things fresh and not just recycle the same job descriptions. Obviously the job title stuff seems kind of way beyond my pay grade on how to change that issue. But anything else? Good comments. Provoking thoughts that's my job description. That's all I'm supposed to do. So if that happened, good. and a great panel of people too, with all kinds of interesting angles on this. Many educators here, so just, I guess, email any of us later if you have more thoughts or would like to talk further. We got another one. I was thinking about the old efficiency studies. Having some people keep detailed logs on what they did might be very illuminating. Yes, who would be willing to do that? I know what you're saying, but it is that kind of job analysis would be awesome, but it's very expensive compared to interviewing people or surveying people. Is that what you're getting at by efficiency studies? To see like, oh, Matt's sitting there in meetings all day. When is he actually getting work done?
Since you brought it up, I'm going to make a comment about meetings. We all complain about meetings, and I do that as well. But part of my, I sort of flip it around the other way. Part of my job is to attend meetings, right? And so I think that's, I remember talking with Ashley about this early on. I think when you were starting your study, like, what do I do? Well, I do emails and meetings, right? It's 80% of my time, but because of my role, that's kind of my job, right? And so, the other things that I'm not doing, it's they're not important, but that's my job. And so some people have the job to do emails and meetings. And at the same time, right, how do we, I wouldn't mind having less meetings.
Wade, this is Nancy. I have a suggestion for a class to take. And unfortunately, I'm having a senior moment and can't remember exactly what this is called. But the technique of, it's an acting technique where you are given a problem and you have to do a presentation on it in a minute or two, I think training in that area would be really helpful for not only reference interviews, but listening and, trying to imagine the other person's point of view. If anybody can think of what that is, that would be, I'm not sure if that's it, Patuchka, but something like that. But that would be interesting. And you can also do that as supplementary. It doesn't have to be a course in a MOOC either. So anyway, anyone can think of the word, I'd be very grateful. Improv, thank you, that's it. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, there's a lot of creative ways to get at this. I'm just looking at some of the other comments too, Jira, and yeah, there's more work to be done for sure, but I just want to make sure whatever we end up doing is shared and useful. So have a good rest of your meeting, and I'll look forward to, yeah, there's all kinds of things. Oh man, and yes, Matt, meetings are undervalued. Maybe I should twist that around like you just did. It's necessary, and those are the most important skills that we've talked about today. So can
you train people to be effective in meetings? Is that something that would you excite people about the profession by telling them their life will be meetings? Maybe not.
But it is part of the reality. So yeah, how to be more efficient. I don't know. That's someone else for another study, I think. But we'll see you all next time, and thank you again.
Thanks.